So this is only going to be one video long, and basically it's going to be a very valuable lesson, I think, in woodworking, and that is the proper way to repair furniture. Now this is a huge panel that's part of armoire. The back side of this panel is actually glass, a glass mirror, so this whole piece is quite heavy, which is part of the reason why it broke. But I had someone stop by my shop and they had this piece in their house, and they had their floors redone, and when the movers moved the furniture and moved it back, they broke this in 3 spots. It was completely separated here because there's a seam here which you can't see, and the 2 bottom seams were cracked as well. I don't do as much of this work as I used to, but if local people drop off their furniture, I don't mind fixing it. But it's very important if you're going to get into woodworking to know how to put things together and take things apart, and a great way to learn how to do that is to fix furniture. Now this wasn't made properly in the first place, but that's kind of par for the course for modern kind of modular, pump it out sort of factory style furniture. But I'll show you how I fix this using floating tenons, which you can use for just about any sort of application. And considering the fact that I use tenons and lap joints to make my furniture, it's a super solid fix and should last forever. And it's a skill set that you can use not only in your own furniture, but like I said, in repairing other people's pieces. So this is the way the piece was dropped off at my shop, and you could see this bottom is completely snapped. So is this other side, and then the top. Now this, I believe part of this is on a seam, but this was mostly put together with butt joints. Where there is seams, like this one I'm pointing at, is a basic tongue and groove seam. It's just not strong enough for something like this. And the whole top is connected kind of with this molding. So the first thing I had to do was pry off this molding enough that I could take the panels apart. So you can see I'm trying to get underneath of it. I did realize about halfway through this process that this molding is not made of wood, it's some sort of rubber-like composite. So that did make this a little bit easier. But I was basically trying to pry this up enough that the brads would come out of the wood and I could take this one arm away. But I quickly discovered I would have to take the whole piece of molding off in order to do that. So what I decided to do was just separate the molding right here. You could see I made a score mark. And if you're very careful with doing this, it would go back together pretty seamlessly, which it did. So I'm just using a chisel. Like I said, this is a composite, so you could really kind of cut this sort of stuff with a butter knife. And I'm just kind of going through with a knife and scoring this enough. I'm undercutting it, so I'm not removing material from that round, almost rosette type structure on the side. And then I could separate these pieces. So you can see where this is a very odd design. There's a seam right below my hands, but where this broke was a seam that they glued together, and I really have no clue why they decided to put this little chunk of wood in the middle there. It's just kind of an odd design. If this was one straight piece, this might not have broken. And you can see I could just kind of pry this apart, and then I could separate this one long leg. This is easier to do if the pieces are separated, but I'll show you later on in the video what you can do if you can't get the entire piece of furniture apart. And you'll see that this will fit back together really nicely. So that was this one actually broke, so there really wasn't anything I could do about it. You could see it's some sort of composite. So what I'm going to be doing is reattaching all these joints. There's going to be 3 of them with loose or floating tenons. People call them different things. So this wood's a little over 1 inch thick, so the rule of thumb is to do 3s. So it's equal, split into 3s. So it's about 3/8, 3/8, and 3/8. It's a little over 1 inch. So I'm just going through and marking that. So the center is 3/8, which is the drill bit I have. I came in about 1/2 inch from the edge. Now I'm freehand drilling this because I can't use this on a drill press. I can't use this on a mortising machine. So this is the easiest way to do it. So I'm just drilling a series of holes. And the other problem with this is you can't plane this joint square. You have to keep it with the jagged edges because otherwise it won't fit back together. So it would be a little bit harder to do on a drill press anyway. But you can see I just make a series of holes, and then if you angle the drill, you could remove most of the bulk, and then you have somewhat of a square hole. To do this on the receiving end, you could see I already had the mortises cut on the two ends. I could line up my marks. It's very important that up and down these are identical, otherwise you'll have, when you go to put it back together, it could be proud or of the surface. You want that to rest flat. If it's not as equal side to side, that's not as big of a deal because you could just tweak your floating tenon. And that's the basic hole I'm left with. These don't have to be perfect because you can customize your floating tenons. But you could see how I'm just doing the exact same process on all of the pieces. Now you could put stuff like this back together with dowels. The problem with that is, like I said, these surfaces aren't flat because they're broken joints. So it's a little bit harder to use tenoning jigs and whatnot on uneven surfaces. This one's not as pretty as the other ones, but it will still do. That drill bit does a great job of squaring up all the edges. You can see this is the joint. It's just a very small tongue and groove joint, which still isn't super strong for something that weighs this much. And I still don't really understand why they have this little piece of wood and then a butt joint on the top. And that's exactly where this broke, was on that butt joint. There's the receiving end as well. And then that will get a mortise as well. Same process. I measured one and then I just lined all of them up to measure the other ones. So here's going through, like I said, a series of holes. It's not super important. I can drill these at this stage. I've been doing this long enough. I could drill these pretty square. If you're not great at drilling these things by hand, you might want to think of a different method or practice a little bit beforehand. But you basically just want this hole to be as square as possible. Then you could do one of two things. You could square this up a little bit, square up the edges, or when you make your floating tenons, you could round over the edges. I usually prefer to square up the edges on my mortise, which is what I'm doing here. It's pretty simple work, just squaring those up so the chunk of wood I put in here will fit in there quite nicely. Now the drill does a really good job of squaring up the other edges, so you don't really have to mess with those too much, and that's basically the joint I'm looking for. This plastic stuff I'm pulling out is what holds the mirror in place. I was kind of hoping I could leave it in, but I didn't think there was a way to reassemble this with it in place. So like I said, I had a 3/8 inch mortise, and what I'm going to do is I just had some pine stock laying around. It's not really imperative that you use some sort of fancy hardwood for this. And it was already 1.5 inches wide because it's part of a 2x4. So all I did was rip it down to 3/8 of an inch. My mortises are about 1.5 inches wide. And then I'm just rounding over the corners, because even though I squared up the corners on the mortises, if you chamfer the edges of your tenon a little bit, it just slides in there nicely. I could get a depth measurement, and I went about 1.5 inches into either side, so the tenons I'm cutting are about 3-inch pieces. And I could just go to the radial arm saw, cut a chunk of this off. You can see how it's going to fit into place. So now this is basically a low-grade way of if you had a domino, you could do this pretty quickly. That's basically what this is. And that's basically what a domino machine produces, is a floating tenon. And then you could see once you hammer this together, that's not really a seam, that's just the crack in the wood. When stuff breaks apart, usually a little bit of the top of the lumber will splinter off. The plus side of doing it this way is if this was a really thick panel, you can make customized tenons instead of something like a domino. So then once I had all my pieces in place, I could just glue this together. I use pipe clamps so it will stay nice and flat. Put a bunch of glue in the mortise holes, and then some glue on my floating tenons, and you could see with that material how well this is going to keep this together. Make sure to hammer everything into place.
The only problem with repairs I find, especially in a shop like mine, is the wood's already pre-finished, so it's hard to keep everything clean. With wood glue on pre-finished furniture, I usually don't get crazy about wiping it off because most of this stuff will have a clear coat on it and the wood comes off pretty easily. I put some clamps on the top just to make sure this whole thing's flat. If I don't glue this together flat, it won't fit back on the piece of furniture. So the next day I could come in and take the clamps off, and after that this thing's pretty rock solid. It doesn't move at all, and it's definitely stronger than what it was originally. So you could see that is the one spot, and like I said, that's not actually a gap, that's just because the wood was damaged when it broke. This one that wasn't damaged as much, you could see that's all that messed up is the finish, and then the butt joint up top, same thing, it's just the finish that got messed up. So at this point I'm putting the mirror back in place, and that plastic actually goes into a groove around the edge, and that's what holds the whole thing in place. Actually, I've never seen this plastic stuff before. I didn't mind this part of the design at least. I also hate having glass or mirrors or anything like this around the shop. I'm not necessarily accident prone, but stuff like this breaks so easily. And then that's how that mirror, like I said, slides into place, and I took some of the hinges off and whatnot to do it. Now I was lucky because I was able to take my whole piece apart. Sometimes, like I'm showing, you could prop it up and drill those mortises, but if you can't, here is another way to do that. So I'm using a palm router to just make a top side mortise. Luckily there's usually a back side to all furniture, so you could always cheat this to the back of the piece. Now I'm not going to go as deep as I normally would because this is just a demonstration, but I'm just taking out that material. Normally I would go probably a little shy of halfway through the piece, and like I said, I would do something like this on the back side. With that palm router I could get pretty close to the marks on the wood, and then I could just clean it up with a chisel. So then you're left with this open face mortise on both of your pieces of wood, and then just like you would a bow tie or a butterfly inlay, that's basically what I'm going to do. You could put a butterfly on the back of something like this, it will be a little sturdier, but if it's something you're not going to see, most people kind of reserve butterflies for stuff you're going to see nowadays, and then you could just cut essentially the loose tenon and pop it into place. Now like I said, I would probably go more like 3/4 of an inch into the wood, but this is another way, almost the exact same way, to repair something that you can't take apart, so you won't be able to drill into the end grain, but also a very sturdy, solid fix. And you could fix a wide variety of furniture this way. Tables, super easy to fix this way. The only thing you might not be able to fix this way are chairs, just because the wood's so thin, but those you can usually throw a dowel in. But this floating tenon material will repair, I think, quite a large swath of material.